As this Reason article says, new federal immigration guidance says stoners lack good moral character. A policy alert from the USCIS agency clarifies that smoking weed, even in states that have legalized it, can still be grounds for denying citizenship applications. So let me get this straight. The completely centralized communistic collectivist state, the government, the biggest murderer of all time, the biggest human trafficker, the biggest thief, the biggest kidnapper, the biggest polluter, thinks they have the moral high ground to tell people who smoke pot that they are immoral, that they lack good moral character. Okay, so I'm going to go into this further in a moment, but first let's look at this article. It's so absurd. Anyway, as it says, today, the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, USCIS agency, which processes citizenship applications and is part of the Department of Homeland Security, oh yeah, there's a moral bunch, released a policy alert saying that consuming state legal marijuana could still be grounds for denying someone's citizenship application. And I quote, "Since 1996, a number of states and the District of Columbia have enacted laws to decriminalize both medical and non-medical recreational marijuana in their respective jurisdictions," reads USCIS's alert. However, federal law classifies marijuana as a Schedule I controlled substance, meaning its sale or possession is still a violation of federal law. Therefore, says the agency, admissions of past marijuana use, even if said use occurred in a state or country where it was legal, could be a bar to establishing an applicant's good moral character, a requirement immigrants need to meet in order to become citizens. With the policy alert, smoking pot explicitly joins the many other vices that could be used to deny aspiring Americans full citizenship. Current federal policy also considers polygamists, adulterers, prostitutes, and habitual drunkards to be unworthy of naturalization. As the Cato Institute's David Beer points out, the new policy goes further than just barring immigrants who've been convicted of marijuana offenses or otherwise admitted to consuming it. Reads the USCIS policy alert, even if an applicant does not have a conviction or make a valid admission to a marijuana-related offense, he or she may be unable to meet the burden of proof to show that he or she has not committed such an offense. Oh, my God. And I quote, "In other words, even if an immigrant attempting to become an American has never been convicted of using marijuana and won't admit doing so, they could still be denied U.S. citizenship," writes Beer. Deeming stoners to be immoral is obviously a pretty antiquated view, particularly given the fact that a full 65% of Americans think marijuana should be legal. And while a lot of progress has been made on that front on the state and local level, USCIS's policy alert is a helpful reminder that federal prohibitions are still doing a lot of damage. And this brings me to this other story, which I think stands out as well. CBD and cannabis could reduce psychosis risk from high-strength skunk, study shows. Buffer effect could point to a protective mechanism that may help treat disorders like psychosis and addiction. And as this goes into cannabidiol, CBD, chemical derived from the cannabis plant, can counteract the effects of high-strength skunk strains and may help to reduce the risk of serious mental health conditions like psychosis, according to a new study. After using scans to study the effects of different strains of cannabis on the brain for the first time, the team from the University College London said boosting levels of CBD could act as a buffer to ill effects. They found that strains with the same level of THC, the chemical which causes users to get stoned, but higher CBD, caused less disruption to parts of the brain linked to addiction and psychosis. Users also reported a reduction in feelings of being high, and experts said this lent support to using high CBD strains for medical users. Over the last 2 decades, and I quote, "Over the last 2 decades, rates of addiction and psychosis linked to cannabis have been on the rise, while at the same time stronger strains of cannabis with more THC and less CBD have become increasingly common, said Dr. Matt Wall, lead author of the study, which was published in the Journal of Psychopharmacology. So let me just get into this a bit. Most of the people I've met in my life have smoked pot, and honestly, while there is the addict forming sense of in the same way as someone could get addicted to a food that's tasty and they like that food and they eat it a lot and they might get fat from it, it's the same goes for cannabis, but not psychosis induced crazy addiction unless you have a completely addict forming personality where you were going to get addicted to something one way or another, whether it was pot or food or drinking or anything. The difference is that most of these other things, alcohol, food, in general, just bad eating habits, cocaine, cigarettes, all these things have a highly more potential of causing an addiction. And it annoys me to see the level of ignorance regarding this stuff from people who probably never smoked this stuff personally. And I realize that it comes down to the individual. Some people have problems, and sometimes they mask their problems in cannabis or prostitution or cocaine or alcohol or food or whatever. Sometimes it's different. Sometimes they mask it in exercising and being healthy. I mean, there's so many ways that people mask mental issues, but that comes down to them as an individual. That's an issue of their own mind, of their own body, of their own being, not the use of cannabis. It's like saying that guns kill people. No. People that use guns can kill people, but they can also save people, just like countless medical marvels have come out of cannabis where people have saved their children's lives, saved their own lives, made their lives better with the use of CBD, THC, cannabis in general, and as well as the incredible potential of hemp and the hemp market, which is just absolutely unbelievable. So when I see stories about them denying immigration, this goes further than just, normal immigration. This also goes to investors who live in Canada, who are invested in United States cannabis companies being banned for 5 to 10 years from entering the United States. It's a U.S. company. They're Canadian. They're invested in it. They're millionaires. In many cases, they don't smoke pot at all, but they get banned. And this brings me to my point. Past cannabis, past any of that, is the fact that the government is an organized crime racket that decides your life for you like a slave. Think about it, folks. You're paying income tax. If you're paying income tax, that's basically you paying rent on your ability to live. You've been forced to pay the plantation owner. And you don't think anything of it? Sure, you get hurt when you see your check and go, oh man, they took money off of it. Why aren't you doing anything about it? Why are you obeying? They are stealing your money to create this gigantic prison state where they wall you in over time, gradually, more and more so, and control you more and more so like an incremental frog boil that you never notice because it's an incremental frog boil to complete collectivism and control and Orwellian control over the populace and pushing people into dependence, making people weaker and stupider, indoctrinating, and making people impoverished and more desperate and indebted. And then creating a giant landmass, which is completely communistic, by the way, this idea that the state owns the land, decides what can or cannot come in collectively for the populace. Like they speak for every individual, going from point A to point B, destroying private property, seizing private property more than ever before in history. And therefore, if they own that giant landmass, as is theorized in communist ideology, then they own everything inside of it, which makes it a prison and makes you a cattle, makes you a slave, makes you a pawn that they're sacrificing for the king and the queen themselves. Why don't people think about this more? Why don't people put this together? They get caught up in the bread and circuses. They get caught up in the cultural attacks and the arguments and the fighting and the nonsense. And why don't people think about this? Why don't people acknowledge this? They just think everything's okay because it's easier or more comfortable for them to be complacent. And that comfort and complacency will lead to the complete control and destruction of the masses and the execution of all remaining free will. Rule yourself, folks. Decentralize everything. Be your own responsible individual. Humanity itself is meant to be responsible, individually responsible, not collectively enslaved for the greater good of the greater number, as someone like G. Edward Griffin would put it. Humanity is meant to be responsible. Responsibility is a hallmark of freedom itself, and responsibility is what's necessary for survival. And if government's going to take every last bit of that away from you and then claim that you're somehow a criminal and a terrible person for using cannabis, a plant, imagine where their priorities are. This entity, the most immoral entity ever, that has killed hundreds of millions of people over the last century. Oh no, but they have a moral high ground to collectively tell people what they should or should not do, or else you can't enter a giant, vast landmass, or you can be put in constraints, aka handcuffs, and thrown in a cage, kidnapped by a bunch of henchmen with shiny badges. It's all a racket. It's all a racket. Don't allow yourself to be controlled and led to the slaughter by it like sheep on a farm, just waiting to be slaughtered, thinking all is good because you got grass to eat for the time being, so you must be free. No mention of the fence getting further and further in, encroaching on your ability to move and walk around freely. And before you know it, you're walking on eggshells. You're being very, very complacent and scared, and you have no more ability to speak out. And then what happens next? You're led to the slaughter, stupidly with a smile on your face, or with great regret that you never did anything when you had the chance. Anyway, we'll continue to cover all this as it continues to unfold. I'm sure it will. Jeff Sessions is out, but government remains the same. Until next time, this is Josh Sigurdson signing out from World Alternative Media. Find the truth, be the change.
Like what you see here, WAM? Don't forget to check the links below. GoFundMe, Patreon. We can't do it without you. Any donation is very much appreciated, especially as we are so heavily demonetized and censored by YouTube as these guys come in and flag all of our content as hate speech. The shadow banning is getting really bad, guys. Also, check our Bitcoin address right here on the screen or in the description below. We really appreciate it. And of course, check us out at the Red Pill Expo 2019. Of course, the great G. Edward Griffin and so many other incredible speakers will be there. Our link for that is below as well. And we cannot forget Mike Maloney's goldsilver.com, which you can also find in the description. One of the greatest market and monetary historians out there. We really encourage everyone to check that out. But until next time, this is Josh Sigurdson signing out from World Alternative Media. Find the truth, be the change.
I'm sure you have already changed people's minds in your young age because you're involved, and I like that.
Thank you.